today I have the great honor and pleasure this day before Christmas, actually. So there's one other person in the universe who's crazy enough to be totally dedicatedly working at this time than myself. And that's my old good friend Marieke. And we decided to meet today for a contemplative talk here in the Contemplative library on stuff that is hugely important and interesting and relaxing for both of us. I think one general backdrop for a nice adventurous contemplative dialogue could be just a short reflection on what we know and what we don't know. I think that one thing that you could say characterizes a deeply contemplative approach to anything is to understand really, or to just at least be able to somehow contemplate the enormous amount of knowledge that is out there, which is almost of a cosmic scale, but then even more cosmic and enormous is all the stuff that we don't know. All the things that the cosmos and that we and the communities and the bodies are doing, and that we're just, slightly beginning to have an idea of the unfathomable depths of. And on that backdrop, I think I'd like to start by asking you, Marieke, how in the world it came to happen that you got into those three tracks of really interesting stuff that you're combining in your work, which is the dancing and the brain research and the meditation. Yeah. So which one of them came first?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I would say that I think the meditation came first, surprisingly. Probably was a 6 or 7 year old kid. I encountered the idea of meditation for the first time when the mother of a friend of mine used to meditate a lot and had a shrine, I think, and somehow that word already piqued my interest, and we would do pretend meditations, had no idea what it was, but somehow I knew that I was interested in it, and that led me on quite a long journey as a kid to explore lots of different religions in the world, and really only as a teenager I started to properly learn about meditation, I would say, when I read lots of books about different kinds of meditation, but really what's touched my heart was books about Tibetan Buddhism, and especially the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by the late Sugyo Rinpoche, and that book sort of really was like, wow, this is my home, this is my tribe. And I went and joined a group, and although since it's been a tumultuous journey, go look it up if you're interested. We can talk about that also if necessary, but it's a different topic. But anyway, I'm still there, and I'm still quite into Tibetan Buddhism, although through Mind Life Europe, the organization that you already mentioned, Niels, and which is where we sort of met. I think now I've also expanded my view of meditation, my approach to meditation, and my connection to meditation. So that was first. And then I would say as a kid, I was already also very, very fond of performing in different shapes and forms. I didn't really know about dance, but I definitely remember like putting up little circuses and theater shows as a kid. Also probably maybe just slightly later, but also with that same friend who lived near where my grandmother lived. So I'd spent quite a few weeks there in the summer, usually playing in the forest and putting up shows and imagining to be knights and what do you call them? The ladies in the Middle Ages. So and fighting dragons and all that stuff. That's what I would do as a kid. And then also putting up these theater shows.
Really? So role play was there before ballet? kind of.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
That's
didn't
nice.
really know what ballet was, but then as a maybe 11-year-old, I came across a book in the library, which was about ballet, and I saw these beautiful pictures of all these beautiful girls
Mm.
wearing pink leotards on a bar, and it's sort of the beauty and the discipline of it together somehow captured in that
Oh.
picture sort of really piqued my interest, and
Mm.
I wanted to do a first ballet class, and um, then I sort of stayed, and I kind of never stopped so many years later. And that was where I got started with ballet. So it was really also something really very much, it's almost like an invisible force that sort of pulls me in there all the
Yeah.
time. I don't really I know why or how.
I think that's part of what we're trying to talk ourselves into here. Those you could say invisible forces really of meaning. It's really interesting with contemplative lives how they kind of have to happen, need to happen in your life, right? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, but go on.
Yeah, no, they sort of you can resist it, but somehow
Yeah,
it just always pulls you
yeah.
back. So and somehow if you follow them, then it leads to very rich results in some way and paths. So I kind of learned to follow them, even if it's maybe a kind of a strange thing to do from a conventional societal point of view. And then I became interested in science. I kind of, I guess, always was a curious kid. So I used to love also to read. I mean, the books I read were basically about ballet, about spiritual things, and about science and when I was a kid, because that's what we would do in the times before computers.
Mm.
And kind of read the whole library, I think, more or less. And oh yeah, philosophy, that's the other genre of books that I would also really love. And then I really I remember that one time in biology class we had to do a presentation about the brain, and that was really like, wow, this is so interesting. I kind of want to do something with the brain. So yeah, that's how I got started with neuroscience.
Mm.
Basically in high school I was like, okay, this is what I have to do. It's kind
Um,
of interesting how all of these parts of my life were kind of super separate. They were like different
yeah.
silos for the longest time until at some random moment, many, many years later, I moved to Groningen, which was like, well, I moved to Groningen about 14 years ago, which is the place where I now live in the Netherlands. And in this, so there at that time, there was a wonderful choreographer living, and I used to take some ballet classes with his boyfriend. Edan Gorlik is his name, and he had this project that I somehow piqued my interest. I wasn't quite sure what I should do with it, but since I was interested in mostly ballet, but probably also dance in general, and it was called the Unblocked Project. And the idea of the project was to do some kind of a procedure with a selected group of, I think, 7 individuals or 6 to unblock some part of their personality through movements.
Oh.
And I was like, I don't know, curious, let's try. And then we did a bunch of movement sessions together and lots of talking. And then eventually the idea of that project was that you would create a piece of art together, and that could be like a performance, or it could be some kind of a art installation or something. And so in my case, it ended up being the idea that there's these 3 parts of myself that somehow want to be connected to unblock. And so that was an interesting idea to me. And so we had this art installation where you had this pillar, and that, you know, the 3 sides were a screen of sort of my body, my movement, and then sort of, I think there was one that was sort of speech, and then he sort of represented that with my hands sort of moving. And there was also, I think the mind was just me talking or something, and that was more the science part. And then somehow they were all the part of the 3 pillars, and so if you looked at the different sides of the pillar, it looked like a different side, but they're all the same thing, something like that. So it was kind of interesting idea, and that set me on the path to ask, like, can I somehow also bring those together? Because especially in our society, I think, you know, in our Western society, like, there's very much of a sense of compartmentalizing. Like, we should keep like science very far apart from the rest of society, because we're abstracting things away so that we can really drill down and understand the phenomenon. And then, so we shouldn't have an opinion, and we shouldn't have an idea as a scientist. We shouldn't have a bias. Sort of forgetting that whatever we're studying, of course, lives in a context and in a society. So that actually in reality is a much more complicated question. But this is how we learn science, right? So we try to repeat an experiment again and again as much as possible in very same circumstances. So we try to create a lab that's very abstract, almost like very sterile, and then you repeat the experiment, and then you try to learn something about the complex, messy reality. And so that's why I think in science we try to keep everything apart so that it's more controllable. But then, you know, sometimes that can create problems when the other parts of your personality sort of feel left out, and you automatically have this competition between how much time should I spend on science and how much time should I spend on contemplation, which actually in some sense also is a necessity for doing good science. And similarly, I think the movement is like connecting to some forms of knowledge that might not have made it yet into words, and therefore would never make it into a scientific experiment, because you kind of need words to plan and think about and prepare an experiment. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I think that that's this kind of development that I've been working with in the past number of years.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a very, I mean, the whole philosophy of science around the points that you're talking about here is so fascinating. And there are a few places, for instance, around the Mind and Life Institute, where something really interestingly new could be happening here. I mean, obviously, it's been the case for a few hundred years that there's what you could say. Yeah, one difficulty is that the English language calls only the natural sciences science. So the way that you just used the word science is in a way correct in English. It would be more complex in languages like your own and mine in German, where we obviously also have the human sciences. But still, I mean, because of the configuration of the developments of the sciences, it's like we have this one very disciplined school of objectivizing science. And you said something really interesting about that a minute ago, that it has a discipline that looks a lot or feels a lot or is a kind of contemplative exercise, which has to do with stepping out of non-interference, which obviously is one kind of contemplative approach, an important exercise, but very obviously it leaves something out. And it does so very strongly that we needed, or our culture needed, to invent a whole different set of sciences, which kind of turned that upside down and focused on subjectivity. So that's one of the few places where I've been doing something that you haven't done more or better. I've been doing the human sciences. Actually, I have a PhD in philosophy. And there's something very peculiar to the human sciences, because it's so very much kind of the negative image of the natural sciences. Very often, as we know in contemplative practices, I mean, if you're compensating, if you're doing the reverse of something, it has just as much power as if you were doing it. So the human sciences, in this kind of classical hermeneutic, phenomenological versions, which is deeply interesting, and I've been spending years inside that part. Somehow it doesn't really escape. Somehow it keeps repeating the same image of non-involvement between the inner and the outer, because it just focuses on subjectivity. You could say it's the third person and the first person approaches. Even the Mind and Life Institute, sometimes in some of the dialogues there, it seems like there's the first person and the third person approach, and we should somehow get them balanced. But that's not that. I think, and I'd like to hear what you think about that. I think that's completely misses the most important thing, which is the second person perspective, which is, I think, we're dancing. And the interesting kinds of embodied practice really comes in, because I mean, dancing is especially interesting, obviously, if you're doing it together. It's always an expression, and even if you're doing it alone, part of the satisfactory part of it, I think, is that you get to know yourself in a kind of dialogue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, trying to parse my thoughts here. I would say, so I'm not even sure whether I think the problem is not leaving out the second person. I think it's almost like I think this is also a difference between the Mind and Life Institute and Mind and Life Europe, where Mind and Life Europe has very much been focusing, especially in the last few years, on the work of Francisco Varela and the idea of enaction and enaction. I found it a very confusing term for a long time. And now how I explain it to myself is this idea that you can never, act on the world as a sort of isolated force. I mean, in a way, I also notice this when I'm doing classical ballet, especially, like if you want to balance, there is no way you can just exert a lot of force and balance, or it's also you can't just find the perfect stable point and balance. You have to always have counteracting forces, and through that interaction is only where you can find the stability. And so I think that's true for a lot of balances, is that you can never just act and do things without taking into account the field in which you are moving. And so
Absolutely.
yeah, it's never an action, but always an enaction is what they termed it, that you would sort of try to feel your way and connect to what are the other forces, and then like you stir the fluid, and then it's not like that moves the fluid around, but it moves the fluid, but it's like you're not completely in control over it. I think that's why I like this idea of stirring, where you're moving things, but you cannot like move every molecule. It's just you're helping to create some movement.
Absolutely. You're not completely in control, but also you're not completely in non-control, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah.
And actually, the further you go into that kind of moving together, the more it becomes clear that, I mean, being someone, being a will, or being a creative participant is always to do with something that you didn't think was you becoming you, and vice versa. I believe also that Francisco Varela is a hugely visionary thinker, and the impact of his thought, I think, is just slightly beginning to be recognized. Interestingly, some of the vocabulary you just used about fields and using force versus using, you could call low tension strategies. I don't know. Are you aware of Kurt Lewin?
No, not so much.
That's exactly his words. Those are exactly his words. As you may know, one of the fathers of group dynamics. And for me, he's, along with Francisco Varela, one of the few thinkers who are adopting a truly second person perspective.
Yeah, and I think for me, like this approach has been sort of slowly more and more the way I've begun to work. I mean, in my scientific work, for example, it is the approach that I can have a plan, but it's through the interaction with, say, the PhD student, and through the interaction with the participants, that the plan gets updated and fine-tuned and improved, and even more so, I'm doing also work in collaboration with Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns in India. And there especially, this approach is super important in India. Idea in the theory of enaction, it's also called participatory sense making. And I think that's a very beautiful way of describing what we're doing, because it's not like I'm coming there as a scientist and do my experiment and take the data and leave.
I think you're sharing something, I think, deeply interesting. The research work that you have been doing with Tibetan monks, exploring an incredibly interesting cultural phenomenon that I found this incredibly beautiful hybrid you could say Chinese, Japanese martial arts and philosophical discourse where we're developing arguments with the body, and the other one is kind of taking it in with the body, and there's traditional movements, but there's really the idea of having you could say a ritualized philosophical fight. But obviously it makes philosophy an embodied enterprise in a way that we haven't really seen in the West, I think. But you went that and did something even wilder, because you make measurements on what's happening in their brains and bodies while they're doing it.
Yeah.
So I think this should be said, because otherwise I think listeners or viewers of this have no idea how wild and wonderful it is, the project that you're talking about. So sorry for the interruption.
Thank you. And thanks for detailing that. And so the life of a monk in these kind of scholastic monasteries, which is one of the, mostly in the Gelug school, is one of the 4 schools or 5 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, depending on how you count, is that they would memorize the text. So they wouldn't also, in that sense, would not read the books, but they would memorize them also, which is also a very embodied activity, like you were saying, like it's sometimes singing, sometimes they use walking around to memorize text, and then to test their memorization and also to motivate them to memorize, because it's kind of like a difficult and boring activity. They would also debate these things for hours a day, and then that is, I think they added in the physical component of this debate in Tibet, so that they did have the debate structure in, for example, the ancient Hindu tradition. They actually also had a similar structure in the Middle Ages in Europe, and even that's probably derived from like the time of Socrates. So the structure has very much similarity to Socratic dialogues and so on. But the physical components probably added in Tibet because it used to, of course, that's a very cold country. So you can never keep up debating for many hours if you're just sitting still. So that was a suggestion by George Dreyfus, who is one of the, well, by now there's a few more Westerners who've learned it, but he was probably the first Westerner to actually live as a monk and properly learn this debate in Tibet itself, I think. So he was saying that it made a lot of sense to him, because it allowed, at least for him, to also get warm, and probably for most of the other monks who are still human, this would make sense. But this was, when I saw it, I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. What are they doing? I had no idea. And this is how we started this collaboration, which was also special, and this is where we get back to the idea of enaction.
A key concept in Francisco Varela's thought, making clear how much the body and even the interactive body is not just a component, but really the central building block in who we are and what we are doing. So this very strong sense of involvement and dialogue as a key
dialogue as a key component, and this is how I also wanted to do science in this project. So I started this collaboration together with Science for Monks and Nuns, an organization that does science teaching for monks and nuns, because something that maybe not all people know either is that in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, through the amazing vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there has been a lot of study of science in Tibetan monasteries. In fact, it is a compulsory part of the monastic curriculum, which is very different from most other religious traditions, even within the Buddhist tradition. But these monks and nuns basically get basic science as part of their curriculum, not in the beginning years, more in the later years. And then, there's been various organizations involved in that. Also, for example, the Emory Tibet Science Initiative, they're the biggest one right now. And I'm also collaborating with them. But Science for Monks and Nuns was the one I started my collaboration with. And I was a scholar in residence from their program, and the idea is that they helped us to equalize our voices. So it wouldn't be the scientist, like the natural tendency was that the scientists would have the largest voices because the monks and nuns are not so much used to actually speaking up. So Science for Monks and Nuns really helped us to say, hey, now we need to listen and try to understand also what is their perspective and what is their interest. And so we started this project really not just from what is our idea and our interest, but really from a dialogue and trying to understand each other and what do we mean with certain words, what do we think is the effect of this debate practice on our mind and our brain and our body. And then how can we test this? And what if we try this? What do you think? And, we try to meet each other in all the steps along the way. And this project has been going on for for more than 9 years now, actually. As we speak, we started in the 15th early December 2015. It's more than 9 years now, and it's very exciting that the collaboration is still going, and we have now already regular calls on Zoom, in addition to me going over there once or twice a year. But it's very much always this, not just me, what's interesting, but both of us what's interesting and what do we think and how can we understand this. And slowly we're learning, they're learning about science and I'm learning about their practices. And together we're producing science.
Yeah, and that's totally fascinating also because it points to how rich a process really, you could say, contemplative practice is, and how rich a process science is, because science is so much more than the results. I suppose I don't know, maybe I've read 1 or 2 papers from that project, but it's not really, I think that even though you may be able to point to some interesting patterns in the brain activities during that, and see similarities with other things that have been found in other brain studies, I think even much more interesting than that, and that's interesting enough, but even much more interesting in that is all the stuff that's happening on the side of cultural exchange and this building up of this really fascinating role that you're mentioning, that science, meaning modern Western science, is assuming or is being given in at least some Tibetan Buddhist schools. I think it's deeply fascinating. It's also deeply fascinating along with this, well, I think maybe overly famous dictum of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that if there ever a discrepancy between science and Buddhism is found, then it's time to start revising Buddhism. That's a very strong thing to say, and very, as you say, different from the approaches of other religions to the challenges of science.
And coincidentally, what I'm finding is that we also need to adjust our science. Well, I mean, in here, I'm mostly meaning psychology with that. Like in the latest couple of studies, we found actually a lot of limitations in our measurement instruments, which have basically been made and validated with Western college students, mostly psychology students. And of course, this has been known for quite a few years and even being called out, but relatively or surprisingly little actually has been done about it to change this Western-centric bias. So it's been really interesting to somehow find myself in this space through this process.
Well, I think that's the many rich ramifications of that growing into. I think there's a much greater impact on the general idea of what Western psychology and brain science could be trying to do. I mean, there's an incredibly large amount of studies of the brain in various kinds of setups that have to do with contemplative practices. I mean, compared to to the space that contemplative practices had in the West just a few decades ago. Of course, it's maybe part of it is that the people who are interested in brains tend to be interested in how you can modify your own experience.
Yeah.
And also, it's easier to make brain studies with people who are sitting still than people doing active stuff. Maybe that's also part of the explanation. But there is a general kind of expansion of interest in Western science in that direction. That's very obvious.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with a realization that there's more and more stress and less traditional religion. So people are
Yeah,
searching for meaning and searching for something to hold on to in a very uncertain world. And I guess contemplative practices are starting to, especially mindfulness, has been starting to take such a place to manage our
yeah,
anxiety, especially with
absolutely.
climate change and the polarization and all of those things. So yeah.
Yeah, and becoming a quite rich field, so that there's not just one mindfulness now. There's a whole branching tree of it. And then, of course, there's the kind of backfiring, the positive backfiring into how Buddhism is managing things in its own field. And one of them is that science is becoming kind of part of their curriculum. And also, and you already kind of touched on that also, it's not just that it's kind of out there as kind of objective points written down in their curriculum. It's also, of course, affecting the way that things are being shared.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the beautiful things, in my view, in modern Western mindfulness, that it's being shared, that it's being propagated, that it's being taught in styles that are so very different from classical, you could say, many kinds of classical meditation teaching is very vertical, one way kind of communication. And there's something much more, I think, effective in a kind of more democratic and horizontal sharing, and that I think that's what the Western traditions are bringing to the table. I think that is really the kind of dialogical, kind of second person perspective. But the interesting thing about that is that this is a perspective that we don't know that we have yet. It's just that we have we're beginning to and we've been having to invent practices that are more democratic and more second person in order to even live in this enormously complex socio-technological culture that we're in.
And I think also another part of it that is that when a tradition like that moves to a new culture, it has to be translated into words or ideas that are relevant.
Yeah,
So I think this act of translation is always associated with a search for meaning. And I notice it too in the other way, other direction, like when I communicate about science with the monks, I get new perspectives. I get unexpected questions about, well, how does this reduce human suffering, for example? And
yeah,
that's a whole new perspective on science. It's not a consideration that we normally make as scientists. And yet,
right.
it's also a very relevant one, actually.
Yeah, and it's not that it's completely new. It's kind of there around the birth of the sciences, but it's kind of becoming just packed into something that people can read a little bit of philosophy the first year of science, and then that's it. But yeah, that's a wonderful observation, that when you in the translation process and in the propagation into a completely different culture is in a way where, well, even a person, but also a culture really finds itself.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the reason that Buddhism is so rich, that this already happened to it quite a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah, true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the other bits that is quite interesting that's now starting to be more and more interest in it is this idea of embodiment, because I think in a lot of, also in the traditional Buddhist cultures, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on embodiment. I guess these embodied practices that the monks do are some exception, but they also only do that for 1 or 2 hours a day, maybe, or
Yeah, and again, just as the rich parts of our own tradition, this is something very rich that they did, but they didn't really theorize it.
yeah.
They didn't really contemplate on why we're doing this. They were just doing it.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah,
so again, then taking it into another culture where you have to explain it, then you start to think about these questions.
yeah,
But at the same time, it also begs the question of what are we doing in our Western education system, where there's increasing anxiety, I would say, and stress in students. And And so together with a couple of colleagues, I've been involved in a project called Embodied Critical Thinking, which also has pitched itself as a project that helps people to deal with the polycrisis they're facing. And it became actually particularly acute because we also had we have some partners from Israel as well. So the whole polycrisis fed right into the project. But the idea of this project is to have a webinar and a summer school and individual research projects for a group of students every year that get selected through a competitive process. And this is an Erasmus Plus project, as it's called. So this means it's a collaboration between European universities. In our case, it is the University of Iceland, Aarhus University, actually also, my university, University of Groningen, the University of Ljubljana, the Technion in Israel, and I think Bielefeld University. Anyway, a number of partners, and we are teaching the students different approaches and methods to connect to their body and also reflect on their mental processes in their academic work. So it's really cool to find myself as part of this to, for example, teach dance at a university to students. Not dance in the sense of like you have to do this and that movement, but dance more as the kind of moving meditation we've also done together, where you're really exploring the ways that the body wants to move in response to certain ideas or response to a certain kind of music, and how this changes when you change the idea or you change the music. And as part of that, we've also taught microphenomenology, a method to really, in a lot of great detail, observe your own inner experience and maybe notice dimensions that otherwise you wouldn't have noticed. And similarly, there's thinking at the edge. It's also a method to get connected to subtle feelings in your body and see how they change or shape the kind of thoughts and ideas you have. So we teach students a whole range of these different methods, and then they get to engage with them in a summer school and then use them for their final project. So it's been really interesting to try to see how, or somehow, these embodied methods have sort of crept into my academic work a little bit and sort of started to become more of the core of it.
That sounds great. And it's deeply fascinating to combine even the title of the project, criticality and embodiment.
Yeah, exactly. Because our idea of critical thinking, at least the sort of the maybe not so nuanced idea of critical thinking is one that is very aggressive and one that's always disparaging and trying to take yourself out of the equation and all the biases removed, as if that is possible. And now the idea is that actually, if you really want to look at things critically, you have to not just think only the conceptual thoughts, but you also have to take into this emotional and embodied layer, this automatic reaction that also is part of the thinking equation, which we've sort of tried to remove from it, but then, you're missing something.
Yeah. Can I throw something in there about critique? What I mean, obviously the word critique or critical derives from crisis. Something being in a strongly transformative process where previous patterns of things are somehow breaking down, or somehow in a breakdown process where something new needs to and has a possibility of emerging. And then, as Hegel pointed out, very importantly, he's a master of critical thinking, of course, or was. Oh, he still lives, I think. He points out the very, very important distinction between what he called transcendental and immanent critique. Are you aware of that? Where transcendental critique is the idea that you can critique something that, or you can and you do critique things very often from external standards. That you're criticizing a phenomenon, well knowing already what would be better here, what would be the right thing. So you're criticizing something for its lack of living up to a standard that you already know. That is not a very productive kind of critique. That's not leading on to something new. But that's obviously something that we're doing often, and sometimes we need to do it. But there's also the immanent critique, which is what kind of the nexus, the focal, pivotal point of Hegel's work. The idea that everything that exists, and this is a very, I think, deeply Buddhist contemplative thought as well, is already in crisis. I mean, the very phenomenon of existence is not durable, it's not tenable. So it's always in the process of breaking down or turning into something else. And the really interesting kind of critique, the immanent critique, the inborn kind of critique, is following that. Is becoming aware of that. Is becoming aware of the criticality that is already there in your at the depth of your existence, and becoming aware of that, being awake in that, is of course being able to be co-inventive in that. So there you have. I think that could be a useful distinction for you. The distinction between immanent and transcendental critique. And I think, I mean, following that up, I think that in a way that what we are doing in moving meditation is a very embodied kind of immanent critique. Systematically returning awareness to things felt in the body that may not be completely, I mean, where things are not necessarily totally in tune. Sometimes things are in tune, then you're just in flow, just like in sitting meditation. There are periods where things are just all right, where there's just this nice deep experience of silence and bliss, and that's perfectly nice. And of course, we should be open for that. But that's not really what meditation is about. I think we can quickly agree on that.
But it's a surprisingly common assumption that this
Yeah.
is what meditation should be, and then
Yeah.
so many people tell me like, I can't meditate, and I was like, well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like, because it's not about having a super blissful, calm experience. That's not the point.
Yeah, and wouldn't you say that if you really ask, then I mean that whenever you're given the incredibly humbling task of giving other people advice in meditation, that the advice to give is pretty much always to say that, well, what you're just becoming aware of here is actually this critical process that's going on inside you, and it's gold. That's really where the gold is, and the more you can be awake in that, the more you're truly meditating.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So if that is true, then I think that is equally true in sitting and in moving meditation.
Yeah, true.
And if it's true, it's equally true in moving meditation. That is, I think, the crucial criteria of moving meditation being true meditation, because obviously this is a question I've been asked many times by my meditative friends. But are you just having a party instead of meditating?
Yeah.
And I always had the hunch, and I have met a few people, including you, who deeply shared that hunch, that, well, this is true meditation. This is just as true meditation as the sitting on the pillow and doing the traditional techniques, because basically it's actually the same process. It looks very different, but it's exactly the same process.
Yeah, and I think it's a different field of experience. So when you are moving, of course, the bodily senses are a much more predominant part of your experience. And so therefore, of course, you become less maybe precisely aware of what's happening in your mind, because when you're not moving, the mind is the only thing that's happening. So it's obviously more easy to focus on that. But at the same time, it also gives you, therefore, a richer field of experience, because there's so much information in the body. And I feel like, so I actually mostly do not practice the moving meditation as such. I do sometimes, like for example, at these kind of retreats and things, but I mostly just practice classical ballet, and that is not necessarily a meditation. In fact, depending on who is your teacher and how you practice it, it can be very non-meditative. It can create a lot of aggressive and competitive thoughts in your head, but also with the right teacher and right approach, it can be a very deep exploration of how to move your body and how to become aware of all the different muscles and different sensations in your body, and also all the difficult thoughts that come up when you engage in such an art that is so, has very much an idea of perfection, that it's that you surely will never reach. And somehow you have to find a way to be okay with that while still reaching somewhere. And I think that is, for me, a very fascinating process to figure out how to do that, and also at the same time to connect to the soul of the dance, and to, you know, not be so self-absorbed, like especially when you're dancing with other people in a class that is to some extent, but even more so in a performance. Then in the performance, it is irrelevant whether the person in front of you is doing it wrong. If they are doing something and you're behind them, you just have to do what they do, so that it at least looks more like you are together than if you just do your own idea of this is right. And so it very much starts to become a process of becoming an ego together rather than an individual person. Like my best experiences, or in some, maybe my most fun experiences in ballet have been when I was able to completely let go of me and just be completely in the group and be there in the story and in the idea that we're trying to express. And I think what is so special about that is that it's in this layer that is beyond or before the words, that are the ideas that are somehow in your body, but you can't give them words. And when you give them words, you sort of flatten their meaning in a way. And that's what's so rich about these kind of practices. And at the same time, you also deal with the very real limitations of your physical being. So in meditation, it's sometimes a danger is that you can go into ideas about reality that are very far away from the current reality, and you can sort of go off, and people do go into psychosis sometimes if they're sort of sensitive to that. And I think these embodied practices make it less likely, because you have to deal with the physical reality. And if you slam your hand or your head against something, you will feel the consequences. And if you especially if you move with other people, like, you can't just do everything, right? You have to be sensitive to their experience and their movement and how they are. And so it has an automatic sense of almost like a critique, like you would say, or maybe a correction, and also that allows for much new things to emerge, because you're not up in your own ideas. You are constantly in interaction, in this participatory sense-making process with another.
Exactly. Yeah, I think many of the really deeply fascinating examples and illustrations you're mentioning here, well, something that many of them have in common, at least, is this underlying idea of a training. A training is a very deeply fascinating phenomenon, because a training is always somehow, it's always some kind of funneling, that you're tuning things very much in one particular direction, and which means, at least for now, that you're ignoring a lot of other stuff to focus very strongly in that direction. And in some ways that could seem paradoxical, when what you're trying to ultimately achieve, at least in the contemplative perspective, is this completely open view where nothing is getting ignored anymore, and you're awake to everything. But a very effective or very necessary step to that is sometimes ignore some of the voices that are very loud, so you can hear other stuff. So I think that's what some of the training is doing. And then obviously, so that makes sense of sitting down and not being involved physically with your body sometimes, in order to be still and listening in the quiet parts of the body. And that also makes sense of the strict kind of training of the body that you're talking about, where you're not doing as we do in what I would usually call moving meditation, of being as open as you could say, intuitive, although there are some problems with that idea as well. But at least being in flow as far as possible, and let things happen as they do by themselves. Then in a certain sense, you're doing the opposite if you're going into a deeply kind of disciplined and structured sequence of dancing, as in ballet. But doing that is opening, as I've sometimes called it, the alphabet of movement,
Yeah.
because
And
you're silencing some things that you think, now I'm going to be completely free and do whatever opens itself at the moment. Then you're going to do exactly what you're most habituated to do. So somehow blocking that, those strongest and most shouting habits a little bit, and letting something else emerge.
yeah, and you need to then repeat something many, many times before they become a natural part of your body. And in some
Yeah.
sense, that repeating things for many, many times is very similar to sitting and observing the breath, right? It's
Or
very
chanting.
boring. And
Yeah.
and actually I've started to get more and more engaged in kinds of ballet training that are like that, very simple and very boring in a way, but also very fascinating, because the more you repeat these very simple exercises, the more you find a tremendous richness in them. Like there's so much to explore and to notice and to slightly change. Like if you just change this little bit, then the experience becomes quite different. So especially I think these very simple and disciplined and boring things can be actually a gateway to a lot of insight, and at the same time they're also a very good attention training, right? That's why
Yeah.
we do still a lot of this focusing on the breath meditation, or focusing on a very simple object, or repeating a mantra. It's all, I think, a very similar kind of process, and then notice
It is.
that there's so much richness in these very, very simple things. And it's almost the opposite of how we live our lives, where we get constantly bombarded with new stuff, and our mind really likes to go to all the new stuff, and my mind does too. And so this is why I
Sure.
need all these very simple things, and to say, okay, no, I have this training where I just don't do new stuff. I find new stuff in the old stuff.
Now, I'd like to try something out, because this is strongly resonant with a contemplative dialogue I had with my good friend Anders, who I believe you never met, but he's very deeply involved in Christian traditions and in Christian contemplative ideas and practices, and he's a radio journalist and doing radio on spirituality. But anyway, we were talking about the phenomenon with younger generations, people who are even younger than us in the West. And something, a general phenomenon that he said he'd experienced, and first thought was a big problem. And I was trying to tell him that it may not be as bad as he thinks, but the phenomenon that people are less and less willing to do disciplined work in the West, because they're so used to other options being given, and they're so used to all kinds of networks being open, and other ways of expressing themselves, that this kind of long time sitting down or practicing one thing or the other is becoming more of a foreign burden now than it was a generation or two before. And I think in a way that is very true. But then I would also like to not be, as I told him, old, angry men, just thinking that everything is much worse now than it used to be. Because then there's also another trend, which is a kind of sharing wakefulness and curiosity, which I think can make up for a lot of it.
Yeah. And I think also at the same time, there is quite some strong interest in these practices, right? But maybe they manifest kind of differently.
I think so.
Like also for, especially in people who maybe identify as neurodivergent, like autism, is very much of a sense of, I need these kind of rituals. In fact, I'm deeply suspecting that, for example, in ballet, there's a lot of people who with some autistic traits who just love the repetition of
Oh
the
yeah,
same thing
that
again.
makes sense.
And probably that is true in general. And for people who do maybe also go to the gym a lot, or that's also, I mean, maybe the goal is slightly different, but people do engage in that kind of behavior a lot still. Yeah.
Can I just try out another idea that I get when you're speaking, I get 10 ideas for every one sentence you say. So I'd like to follow up on all of the ramifications. But we were talking like 2 or 3 rounds ago about moving meditation, of the kind of explorative and non-directive sense, which you say that that's not a thing that you're doing a lot, although you do somehow play with it in some groups sometimes, and at least you've also participated in what we did in Denmark with moving meditation. Well, just to come back to it, I believe that the kind of awareness that it produces with the body of the criticality happening in the mind-body system, for some people becomes an opening to realizing how much of a role the body is really already playing in the silent meditation. Because even, I mean, though you say that when we're sitting down and doing silent meditation, the mind easily takes the main role, but the body is really still there, and it's very violently there, and it's really trying to speak. And if you're really being aware of what's happening with your mental system and your emotional system, one way of becoming much more critically aware of it is allowing this all those stories of the body that is trying to be told all the time in that process, and that we're systematically used to ignoring, but it's becoming increasingly difficult the longer time we're sitting still.
Yeah, true. And then
which is part of the reason it can be very you're mentioning that some of the people were not comfortable sitting for a long time, which is exactly for this reason.
Yeah.
But having practiced a little bit in moving meditation, well, those stories are actually interesting. Or stories are not necessarily narrative stories, but there's this whole field of sense and knowledge and ambiguity that you can take it in and say, well, that is exactly being awake. That is.
Yeah, and also I think there's a lot of energy. I mean, I don't really like that word energies, because it sort of takes us into, like, it has associations with all kinds of quote unquote vague things, but like emotions can carry a lot of physical energy. I mean, I notice this too when I get a little angry, like for example, they closed off the road where I need to go and I'm in a rush, and then, you know, I will cycle so fast, like to the next, because I have this anger energy in my body. So it's also therefore very adaptive, because it does, as long as you don't use it to hit another person, you know, it's
exactly
fine. But
that's what part of the beauty of at least some corners of the Tibetan tradition, that they really acknowledge that, right?
And I do find that these embodied practices can sometimes be much more effective to actually handle these energies, give them way out. Like when I have very, very strong emotions, also, for example, when there's a really like a person has died, or a person I know is like really sick, or I get that news, or there's some very dramatic world news, I will sometimes dance to just let that energy sort of out. And I find that way more effective than just sitting with it. And somehow that's just doesn't, for me at least, and I've heard other people say that too, or kind of are other maybe artistic expressions. So I think for different people, there might be different ways, like singing or painting or something. But these kind of modes of expression, I think for strong emotions, they might be much more effective than what you're just told in some of the meditation traditions, is just observe them. They will, you know, go by themselves. And yes, they do. But sometimes I feel that they're not, for me at least, completely processed. It needs more.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And also, that's a possibility of ending, because I was actually trying to. We've been talking longer than expected, and that's because so many great things come up. Of course, there's a possibility that this is not one, but two dialogues. But I think this can be edited into a very nice piece of about 45, 60 minutes. And then we can see where the strongest loose ends are, and then possibly make a number 2 in a month's time. How about that?